Lee, where are you from? Does that say Massachusetts? Is that?
Yep, that's me. Yep, I'm from the NACDD Council.
Oh, great. I'm from New Hampshire, so just above you.
Howdy, neighbor.
Howdy. Are you in the Boston area or somewhere else?
I'm not. I'm in Western Mass.
Yep.
Yeah, I actually live in Westfield, so I am about 15 minutes west of Springfield.
Yep. My sister's in Northampton, and I went to UMass.
Yep.
So
you know exactly where I am.
Yes, I do.
And it's not just filled with cows, like everyone seems to think. The eastern part of the state.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And Kat, where are you? Are you from, is it Indiana?
Yeah, I am with the Indiana Governor's Council.
Great. Awesome. Nice to meet you.
I actually went to your training in Denver in 2019.
That was a while ago.
It was.
Oh, great. You know, the name looked familiar, but I thought, oh, maybe I saw it somewhere. Yeah. Well, nice to see you again.
Sort of like we think things is pre-COVID or post-COVID anymore. Anything that happened before the pandemic hit, I lose track of. How long ago was that?
Yeah. I know. It's not over yet. One thing we noticed in the beginning of Zoom, people came on early all the time, make sure it all works. Now people just fly right in at the end, you know. Molly, will you do any sort of introduction or do we just start?
I can introduce three of you, I guess, if you want, or you can jump right in.
Yeah, we can do that part.
Okay.
All right, so we should get started then because it's 2:00. I'm Katherine McLaughlin, and I have been a sexuality educator and trainer for over 25 years. And my specialty is sexuality education in people with developmental disabilities. And I've been doing this work for a while, but I started a business, Elevatus Training, about 4 years ago, and have been able to do this work full time, which has been great. I'm going to take us through a few slides and then have Kim and Mary introduce themselves. And we may have one more person joining us. But let me share my screen and just tell you what we're going to do, and then they'll be able to introduce themselves. All right, so here we are. And these photos were taken in Michigan. Mary will be telling you about the Michigan project. But these are self-advocates and professional teams training, learning how to teach sexuality. And what we're going to focus on is the importance of sexual self-advocacy skills for individuals, and then how these skills can also be generalized to other aspects of a person's life as well. We're also going to look at the importance of effective, positive, and inclusive sexuality education and the best practices around that. And then we're going to talk about ways to support, educate, and empower individuals to become sexually healthy. And we're going to do that by looking at 2 statewide models that I've been involved in, and Mary and Kim and also Andre, who may not be able to make it. But we'll talk about 2 different projects and some of the results of those and answer any questions about those. So here's our agenda, pretty much what I just said. But we're going to talk about what is sexual self-advocacy, the qualities of a strong sexual self-advocate, effective education, and then the 2 projects. And then the DD Council, Kim and Mary will talk about kind of their perspective on the project as well as a DD Council. And then we will wrap up. And I think most people, sort of have the Zoom down, but, we'll keep everyone on mute and you can have your video on or off. We love to see your faces. It helps with engagement for everyone. So if you can, that would be wonderful. And if you need a break, you can turn it off. We're going to stop at different points for questions. So you could put them in the chat. And I think Molly's going to be kind of watching that and interrupting us if she needs to. But for the most part, we'll answer them kind of in chunks as we go through the material.
Sorry, yeah, I just wanted to jump in and say this session is also being recorded. So you'll be able to find a recording of it after the session, and the closed captioning should be on, but if anyone's having any issues with it, just say something in the chat and I will figure that out.
Great. Thanks, Molly. All right, so I introduced myself. I'm in New Hampshire, by the way, and we can have Kim go next, or Kimberly.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. My name is Kimberly Berg, and I am a program planner at the New York State Developmental Disabilities Planning Council. So I am the planner on the Individuals and Families Committee. And our committee portfolio is quite broad, but one of the projects that we oversee is the Sexuality and Healthy Relationships training. So I'm excited to share a little bit more about that later.
Great.
And I am Mary Shehan-Boogaard. I am the Community Inclusion Coordinator for the Michigan Developmental Disabilities Council. Been a sexuality educator for, I'm kind of sad to say, for about 40 years now, which really kind of dates me. And I'm the lead staff for the Michigan DD Council Sexuality Education Initiative, which we'll talk about later as well.
Yes. Do you want to just say a little bit about Andre?
Yes, Andre is one of our peer educators. He works as a peer mentor at a CMH until recently, when he got a new full-time job, an inclusive job in the community. So he is a sexuality educator that was trained through our initiative, and he's hoping to be able to get on. He's having some internet issues. So I'll leave that introduction for now, and we'll hope he can join us a little bit later.
Great, thank you. And it looks like Lindsay put in the chat that in Oklahoma, there's a group of self-advocates that are developing training for sexuality. That's awesome. We'll have to hear more about that.
Yes.
Yeah, so let's go through this and then we could hear a little bit more about the Oklahoma when we talk about the self-advocate perspective too. So Kim.
Great, thanks so much, Catherine. Yeah, so before we get into the kind of meat of the presentation, we did want to go through some group agreements, or basically ground rules for today's presentation. And I think that these are probably all in some way familiar to folks and will resonate, but especially on a topic like this, we just wanted to go through what the ground rules are and then have you guys weigh in the chat box with any additional rules that you think might be helpful. But the first one is respecting a difference of opinion, right? So we're all coming from different places and different experiences, and we want people to share and be able to kind of discuss and have that dialogue. And so part of that is respecting that we all have those different perspectives. Don't yuck my yum is kind of a similar thing in that, if someone is expressing their opinion and it's different than yours, be responsive in a positive way, right? We don't need to kind of make people feel shame or make people feel that their opinion is somehow wrong or bad. So just being respectful of people sharing, essentially. Confidentiality, so stories stay within the group, but lessons leave, right? So people often share and use examples to help kind of communicate their point, right? And so that might be helpful, but really it's the actual point, the actual lesson that should be the takeaway, not someone's personal or experiential story. Step up, step back. So this is really about being respectful to everybody. Everyone knows, you know, there's oftentimes the talkers of the group, right, who really like to share and really like to participate. And then we have some wallflowers who like to spectate and, you know, hear the conversation, but we really want to make space for everybody and everybody's voice. So if you're a person who really likes to share, just make sure that you're kind of being aware and taking a step back, letting other people share as well. And then if you're a person who isn't always comfortable sharing, hopefully you will feel comfortable enough to share and to participate as well. Notice your assumptions. So again, kind of what biases are you bringing to the table? And some of the conversation might kind of trigger some of those. So just having that awareness and how that then impacts your work, and especially this type of work, sexuality training for people with disabilities. And then lastly, there's no such thing as a stupid question, right? So we really want to foster a dialogue and a conversation. And so a large part of that is everyone feeling comfortable to be able to ask and to be able to put those questions out there. So I will have people, if there are any additional ground rules or anything else that you think would be helpful, to just put those in the chat box. And yep, moving on to the next slide is fine. We'll go on to that, but I'll just have people add anything to the chat box that they felt maybe was missing or that they would also like to see as part of those ground rules. All right, so we're talking about sexual self-advocacy. So first, let's define what is self-advocacy. Well, it's really, as you know, everyone on this call knows at this point, right? Speaking up for oneself, speaking up in terms of ways that life can be improved, the changes, the types of things you would like to see in your own life relative to maybe what hasn't been the case or what you haven't had access to, but also coming together with others who share similar experiences and working together to advocate for society, right, to improve society and make progress in society. So our first question for everybody is, what does sexual self-advocacy mean? So I'll have people go in the chat, and actually we don't, I think we have a manageable number of participants, so if people want to share, unmute yourself and share, you can do that as well. So what does sexual self-advocacy mean? All right, so not hearing or seeing anything in the chat box. I guess we'll go to the next slide. Oh, there we go. So Lee added advocating for your relationship preferences. Absolutely. Kat, feeling comfortable, informed, and empowered to make decisions about sexuality for yourself. Yep. Stephanie, being able to speak out for what you want sexually, feeling comfortable to do so. Absolutely. Those are all really good responses and all part of this broader kind of sexual self-advocacy. Very good. Yep. So next slide. So some of these are, you know, you guys have just mentioned, right? Speaking up for yourself. One of the big ones is access to information and education, right? So oftentimes we find with the IDD population, and at least this is the case in New York, I can't speak, you know, everywhere, but even like students with IDD in school still will be removed from health classrooms. So they're not even given the opportunity to learn healthy relationship information. So sexual self-advocacy can be access to that information and education in the first place. So that's a really important piece. But you guys are absolutely right. You know, feeling empowered and feeling comfortable and confident enough to speak up for yourself, speak up for what you want, what you don't want. Stephanie, I saw that you added understanding what is appropriate and inappropriate to protect yourself. Absolutely. And that gets into the abuse prevention piece. So that's really important. Setting limits and boundaries for what you're okay with and what you're not okay with. And then really control over your life, how you express yourself, how you express your sexuality. And then again, the right to information, right? And being able to make informed choices. That's really the key. I'm just looking at the comments too. So in Oklahoma, if you're on an IEP, then you're automatically opted out of having sexuality education. So your parents have to opt you in. Yep. So there's a great example of, we're not even allowing people the opportunity to learn. So that's a huge problem and a huge gap. All right. Thank you, everybody who responded. That's very helpful. All right. So next slide. Yeah. So sexual self-advocacy, according to the Green Mountain Self-Advocates, and I happen to agree, is more difficult than regular self-advocacy. Well, why is that? Well, we think about how difficult self-advocacy and the disability movement over the decades has been, right, to make substantial progress. Well, when you add the sexual self-advocacy component, then we get into another layer of opinions and biases, and oftentimes what's a taboo topic, right? Sexuality. Think about how difficult and how kind of uncomfortable that conversation can be sometimes, especially depending on who, the audience that you're speaking to. So there's kind of an added layer of trying to break through some societal assumptions and opinions in order to make progress. So that's, I think the intent, obviously, of Katherine's work, but also the councils that are involved in this type of work, is to help not only get that information out there, but to shift some of those opinions and ideas about for whom relationships and sexuality apply and for whom they don't, right? Because there are some ideas about who is appropriate for relationships and who are not supposed to be having sexual relationships. Right, and I think that wraps up my part, right? Right.
Mary's going to talk in just a minute, but I wanted to put in the chat a link to some handouts, and one of them is the Green Mountain Self-Advocates pamphlet on sexual self-advocacy, plus a couple other things, and these slides as well, if you're interested. So, okay, Mary.
Okay, we seem to have lost the slides though.
Oh, well, yeah, that's silly of me. All right. I don't know why, but here we go. There you go. How's that?
So on this slide, some of the concepts that we wanted to talk a little bit about were how sexuality education is why and how it's so important. And a big reason is because our sexuality as human beings intersects with so many other life domains. How, when, and with whom we express our sexuality can affect things like employment, housing, community access, and of course, the relationships in our lives. So it's so important for people with disabilities to receive that education. As highlighted by Kimberly, there are many, many states who don't provide any sexuality education at all for individuals who are supported under an IEP or in special education. Other states offer some things, but many times families then opt people out. So you have to ask yourself, where do people with intellectual and developmental disabilities get information? We want them to receive education that builds on their sexual self-advocacy and help to develop those skills. So as you see on the slide, a strong sexual self-advocate believes. They have explored and examined what are their own beliefs and values regarding that. So that's step one, knowing yourself. And two is gaining knowledge. Knowing what you have now as a knowledge base and seeking out further information. So people need a strong knowledge base of factual information covering all the dimensions of sexuality, not just that three little word sex. And that's often something that we as educators talk about as we're beginning to get a group together. We will talk about the difference between sex and sexuality. We're not sex educators, we're sexuality educators. And the one is a much bigger topic than just that three-letter word that refers to intercourse. We're talking about all of the 16 dimensions of sexuality. And then lastly, people need skills. They need information on how, when, and with whom to share beliefs and knowledge. So for example, this morning I was working with a number of co-facilitators on a training called Building Healthy Relationships at Work. And so, it's just so evident to many of our vocational specialists in our state that this is an area where people struggle once they get a job. They've worked very hard and educated themselves to get a job, and they're able to do the task. But what trips them up sometimes and creates a situation where they're either disciplined at work or they lose their job because they're not understanding different relationship types and how those need to, what the boundaries of those are in the workplace. So again, an example of how sexuality intersects with all aspects of our lives. If you could go ahead to the next slide. So when we think about how do we help build these sexual self-advocacy skills, we start with the history, as we often do. Those who do not remember the history are doomed to kind of repeat it. So when we think about what is the history for each individual, we have to think about what is the sexuality education that you received? What were those primary messages that you got early on? And so we start with talking about that in class. So I'll ask people just to drop in the chat, just some big messages. We don't want or have time to talk about all the nuts and bolts, but just what were some of the primary messages that you got about sexuality? Think back to your earliest messages about it. And I'll give a minute for people to write in the chat. While people are writing that, I'll just talk about the fact that messages about sexuality often are surprising to people how early those messages are, how early they come in American culture. So I'll often ask people, that phrase, when did they first hear about sexuality? I will tell you things that just if it happened in my own life, my son, who's now 24 and engaged, I had to explain to his fiance that she would be his second wife because he was married on the playground in preschool. So when you think about that, messages early on, 3 and 4-year-olds talking about partnering up and marriage and what those messages are that they received early on. So I'm seeing some things coming up in the chat. Joni writes that sex was wrong. We have many, many self-advocates that come to classes or come to become sexuality educators, peer educators in Michigan, who say that that's the only message they got. Sex is just wrong. It's not for you as a person with a disability. And talking about sexuality at all, again, I use the word sexuality and not sex, is something that they just shouldn't do. Someone writes, 5th grade menstrual cycle discussion, complete with straps and padding in a box. I only talk about sexuality with friends. I never talk about it with an adult or in school. In Indiana, most of our education was based on STIs. Abstinence is the only way. Parents are always open with me about, so what's appropriate, what's not, due to my physical situation. So yeah, people get lots of different messages. And understand too that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities get messages too from a very early age. And if we as educators aren't providing that message and parents are not providing that message, you have to ask yourself the question, where are they getting those messages? And largely it's from the internet, largely it's from peers, and largely it's from social media. So you have to think if they're getting factual information within those messages. So when we think, gosh, we really want people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to have a quality education, we have to think about what makes a quality education. So if you go on to the next slide. So sexuality education curriculums or programs kind of come in what a lot of educators talk about are 3 packages. One is abstinence only, and you can just do a minimal amount of research and get information from, journals and from reliable organizations about abstinence only. The Journal of Adolescent Health cites the problems with just abstinence only. Lots of other programs and services talk about that. The Sexual Education Council of the United States and the Academy of Pediatrics also talks about abstinence only programs to teach about sexuality education and what people miss within that. And then in some areas, they do an abstinence plus. So you might focus on abstinence, but you get abstinence and some information. But for example, in some states, in schools, they're not able to teach anything about contraception. So they're getting abstinence plus, but huge pieces of those 16 dimensions of sexuality are not happening. And then the third is what we would recommend as educators is comprehensive. And what I always say is covering the full 16 dimensions of sexuality. Sex is just one of a much bigger topic. And we want all of these topics to be included, not just for young adults, but also for young adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So if you'd go to the next slide. Effective sexuality education is positive in its approach. We heard from some of the comments in the chat, this when sex is fear-based, how that affects people. And those messages that they get early on in life can really transfer onto as they become an adult and an older adult if the messages were fear-based. It needs to cover many needed topics, what I call the full range of 16 dimensions of sexuality. And it needs to empower and by giving information, recognize the autonomy of each individual with a developmental disability and empower them to seek the information that they want and help them with the skills to find that information. It's inclusive of all gender and all sexual identities, so no one feels invisible in the classroom. It helps people become healthy and have positive relationships, so identifying the differences between positive and unhealthy relationships. And often those are the things that are not really portrayed in the media. Comprehensive versus abstinence only. And we have on here the SHEIDD assessment tool. And that's a tool that can be used. You can Google that and get more information about it. Kimberly, do you want to make a comment about that tool? I know you've used it more extensively than I have.
I actually haven't used that, so I cannot make a comment.
Yeah, so I can tell you about it, but it's a curriculum tool that you can use where you check off to make sure that it's a cognitively accessible. It's really guidelines for curriculum for people with developmental disabilities. So you can kind of, if you're using a particular curriculum or something, you can check off and make sure you're covering all the topics using different kinds of teaching. And so it's a really good tool.
And when we think about it, just think in terms of that comprehensiveness and the fact that we've talked about sexuality intersects with so many other aspects of our lives. You really want to develop a curriculum or have a tool that covers all of those things. Because if you're missing pieces there within those 16 dimensions, you can actually cause harm to an individual. And so, we want to avoid those situations. Next slide.
Yeah, I think it's me, but I also see that Andre is here. So I wonder if he just wants to introduce himself. I just want to make sure he...
Oh, Andre, welcome to the group. Are you able to unmute and introduce yourself? Okay, he might not be able to. If you can just drop in the chat when you're able to speak, and then
I don't hear.
later.
He's right there.
Okay. You want to introduce yourself, Andre?
Hi, everybody. I don't know if you can hear me.
You can.
My name is Mr. Andre Robinson. Uh, I got this training years ago through Mary and Katherine, and it's been very helpful to me in my own life. Uh, I I love being involved in this because my mother gave me my talk early on in my life. So I just want to pass it on to other folks.
Awesome. Thank you, Andre. And we're going to bring you back a little bit later for some slides.
Yes, thanks, Andre. Glad you made it. So just one of the things is, we've talked about the problem of lack of sexuality education, people being removed, all of those things. And, really what we're striving for is, imagining a world where everyone, including people with intellectual developmental disabilities, have positive, satisfying, and healthy relationships. Like, that's kind of our dream for everyone, right? And that sexuality education is more accessible, meaning that it's more cognitively accessible, or location, or all kinds of things, just more access. And also that self-advocates are co-leading these classes. So we'll be talking about both of the projects, one in New York and Michigan, where we've already trained in Michigan self-advocates, and we're going to train in New York self-advocates as well. And it sounds like Oklahoma is doing a similar thing. And that there's improved sexual health, and there's fewer cases of abuse, charges of sex crime, and job loss, and many other negative consequences of a lack of education. So that's what we're imagining. And there's many challenges too. And we have some statistics here. So many have not received it, yet want and need it. Many people. And I'll be sharing some quotes from some self-advocates.
That is true.
Isn't it? Yeah, people
For
really.
A lot of folks.
Yeah.
I was very fortunate.
Yeah, Andre, it is true for a lot of people. And I do remember you saying that you had a lot of information growing up, where not everyone does. So, you were more fortunate. But one of the statistics is that people with IDD are set.
It's very important that we spread the word, and we able to do like this, because fortunately people don't get to talk like I did.
Yeah.
And they think you don't want to be you don't want to be active like that, but it's not true for everybody.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So there's a lot of, negative consequences here. We're talking about loneliness and sexual abuse, but also sex crimes as well. And lots of times.
And it's important being prepared for people with developmental disabilities to have all the information so they can protect themselves.
Exactly, right. And we can reduce these statistics. Absolutely. So both of these projects, the focus is sexual self-advocacy, providing, like Mary said, medically accurate, age-appropriate, and cognitively accessible sexuality education. It includes self-advocates in the curriculum that's used. It was developed by myself and Green Mountain self-advocates. And I immediately, as an educator, thought, I'll create a curriculum and I'll teach it. And the self-advocate said, no, I don't think so. No, nothing about us without us. And reviewed all the lessons. And then the curriculum is designed to be team taught between a self-advocate and a professional. And then, another thing is just the whole state. Like when Mary will talk about Michigan, there are, I can't remember the numbers, teams all over the state of Michigan. So for pretty much any area, maybe not so much in the Upper Peninsula, but you can have access to sexuality education as someone with a developmental disability. And one of the teachers is someone with a developmental disability. So that thinking about this statewide idea.
It's important for young folks to get this, to try to understand themselves.
Mm-hmm. Right, absolutely. Yeah, who you are, your identity, all of those things. But the Green Mountain Self-Advocates said, I asked them, why do we want and need sexuality education? And this is a lot like Andre's saying, so we can learn to have healthy relationships, so we aren't lonely, so we're able to make informed choices, so we can pick the right person for the toughest part of the relationship, making it last.
I just got finished taking a sexual harassment training at my new job.
Yeah. Good stuff to learn about. So we can be safe because we all have desires and needs, and that's okay. So that people know their rights, so that people can be sexual self-advocates and not just self-advocates. So self-advocates want and need the information, they're asking for it. And usually it's people around them that have more of a reaction and fear and don't want them to get it because they're protecting, they're trying to be protective. But we've got two different training models that we've used, and they're innovative and inclusive. They're really about capacity building so that, like I said, lots of teams all over Michigan, and the state of Michigan is going to continue to train more people, and it just kind of keeps going. Better access, which is what we've been talking about. Improved.
I'm gonna do what I can, but my job is it's a lot of strenuous stuff going on at my job and stuff. So I'm gonna do when I can, what I can.
That's right. Yeah. No, that's great.
Mary, and we just have to work it in when I can, because I got a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah, you sure do. Yep. And really the focus is prevention and things that can be sustainable. So how do we set something up so that a state can continue to provide this access? We're going to share two projects. And the first one is the Michigan one. And Mary's going to tell you about this project.
So we started out in 2000. Well, let me say, I started out with the council in 2017, and there wasn't anything in our plan at that time that was talking about sexuality education. But back in 2017 in Michigan, there were three major things that happened that led us to have to change our plan midstream. Or I won't say change our plan, but add some things to our plan. So in 2017, we had the National Public Radio did an expose, a series. Katherine was one of the national experts interviewed for that, on the sexual abuse and exploitation of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So that was sitting out there. Yeah, so that was sitting out there. And yeah, I know they did a training about that at Cobo Hall in the Detroit area where you're from, Andre. And then the second thing that happened is NACDD put out, it was about a 19-page policy brief about sexuality, sexual abuse and sexual exploitation. And kind of the way it was worded on the last page was sort of like, and what are you doing about it? And so it made us as a council say, what are we doing about that? Are we involved in this? What are we doing? And then the third thing was the Nassar scandal. It was on national news. We had a sports doctor on MSU's campus, which is right here in Lansing, where our office is. And he was abusing our national athletes, primarily our gymnasts. And, so it was kind of hard to okay, we always knew we needed to do something, but with that in our face, we really said, okay, we can't wait. We need to do something now. So we started with the initiative. I evaluated curriculums, and, I wanted a curriculum that included people with intellectual and developmental disabilities from beginning to end. So that was one of the most attractive things about the curriculum. And, when I contacted Katherine, it was like kindred spirits. We had the same idea of where we saw this going in Michigan. And so we brought her in, and she trained 11 teams from around the state. And when she
Yeah.
described the Upper Peninsula earlier, it's the most rural area of our state and the lowest density of population. And so in that first, and I think Andre was in that first cohort of training back in 2018, we trained 11 teams. The teams were made up of parents and professionals and self-advocates in each area. And so that's what we were doing. Andre, did you want to share just a brief comment about your training back in 2018? Go ahead, Andre, you're not on mute.
I just wanted to say, Mary, I thank you for wanting me to participate, even though I was busy this time. I'm real busy now that I got my new job, so. And
Okay.
I want to participate as much as I can.
Okay. So you can hear from Andre's voice, like, this is really important stuff.
I got a lot of stuff going on right now.
Yeah. Bringing people that have the lived experience of those mixed messages that they may have gotten or no messages that they got from an early age from a trusted source. It just brings about the importance of having people with disabilities involved from beginning to end. So creating the curriculum, vetting the curriculum, some of their artwork appears in the curriculum in some areas, and then teaching the curriculum, building those skills to become peer educators. So we had 11 teams the first year. Then we had Katherine come back and we did another 3-day training. And from there, we really kind of focused when we were marketing that to areas of the state that hadn't been hit. So if you haven't seen Michigan, it's like a mitten, and then you have the Upper Peninsula. And so we knew there were some areas up in the north west corner of the Lower Peninsula and the Upper Peninsula. So we focused on that. So we were then able to vet a total of 26 teams, including some teams from the and the Upper Lower Peninsula. Go ahead, Andre.
It's important that parents really need to understand that it's not, you're not giving nobody no tools to go out and get pregnant, to go out and just do wild stuff. You're giving them the tools to be safe and enjoy life.
Right. So it's not about just teaching sex and intercourse. It's about teaching about sexuality, which includes things like laws that pertain to sexuality. It includes gender identity and many, many topics, all of the 16 dimensions. So then in the third year, we really focused on how do we make this sustainable over time. And so that first year, Katherine brought a self-advocate that had been trained from another state. The second year, when she did the 3-day training, she had self-advocates from Michigan that had been trained the first year involved. And then we did a TOT training. So now here in Michigan, we can provide, we can create more teams with more educators right here using the curriculum and having access to the resources. And of course, in this third year, we had the added barrier to get through, and that was COVID, and learning to do this instead of in person, virtually. And so we've seen, that happen. And we have many teams that continue to be up and running throughout COVID, just doing a virtual model of the same curriculum. Do you want to go to the next slide? So Andre, do you want to talk about these numbers a little bit, or do you want me to do that? Andre, I know there's a little bit of a delay in your internet. I'm going to go ahead and get started, and you jump in if you want to at any point. So since the 2018, when we began, 31 individuals with IDD, with intellectual and developmental disabilities, are now trained as sexuality educators and work among the teams. Do you want to do the next one, Andre?
Yeah, I'll take it.
Okay. Are you able to see the slide?
Yes.
Okay, so I did the 31. You want to do the next one down?
Yes.
Okay, Andre, there's a big delay in your internet, so I'm just going to read these and then I'm going to ask you to come in at the end and tell me your thoughts about it. So there were also 70 professionals and parents that have been trained as sexuality educator and provided with the tools. Since the 2018 summit, the benefits of training those teams were 240 family members were educated about the curriculum and the importance of teaching their family members about sexuality and discussing that with them. 139 transition staff in the school districts have been trained. 502 people from other agencies. So that could be our behavioral health in Michigan, the local CMHs or community mental health. It could be other advocacy organizations and provider organizations. And then 638 individuals with IDD. And now we're up actually, since those statistics happened, to over 800 people, just with some summer initiatives that we have going on. Andre, anything you want to say about those numbers?
I just think it's important for us to keep driving home that we are people too.
Right.
And that we deserve a chance at real life, all type in every way and stuff. That's why I always wanted to participate when I can, because my mother and father was able to give me the talk, and they didn't hold nothing back from me. But everybody don't have the opportunity that I did when I was coming up.
Right. So important. All right, I think we're ready for the next slide. So I think these are actually statistics.
Yeah, that's supposed to be June. So that was the post-training assessment that we did, the first.
So, yeah, we have some data from Michigan, more than just numbers of people. What we didn't do initially that we are doing now is we do the pre and post assessments. And so we can see what you're going to kind of look at from the New York data, the amount of knowledge people had when they began the course, and then at the end of the course, how they've gained knowledge and those percentage points. But from June of 2018, 32 of the 46 participants took the post-training assessment and 32 passed. All right, there were some individuals who came because there's a lot of components that go into becoming a sexuality educator. And sometimes you have to try something and be exposed to something. And one of two things will happen. You'll either figure out, wow, this is exactly what I want to do, or wow, now I know I don't want to be a sexuality educator. So we did have some people who made that decision, and that's great. We want them to make that autonomous decision that makes sense in their life. And then in October, all 58 participants took the post-training assessment and 57 passed with a 98% or higher. Okay, I think we're ready for the next slide.
Okay. Whoops.
So the self-advocate's perspective, Andre, this is going to be you. How have you, we talked a little bit about how you've been involved in the initiative. Just in one sentence, tell us again why it's an important initiative for people with disabilities.
It's all about living a real life in every aspect of life. We deserve to have a whole life, and that's the whole thing that I want to express.
All right. Well said. Next slide. And so these are some comments. You've heard a little bit from Andre. These are some comments from some of our other peer educators. Bonnie Gonzalez is a frequent educator. She's from the Muskegon area of our state. I've shared topics from the curriculum with people with disabilities and others without, because the message about being a strong sexual self-advocate is universal to all, because all too often people don't have the opportunity to get proper education, irregardless of whether they have a disability or not. So thinking of people with disability in the context of all, as the life course often says, it's good information for all people. Frank is another sexuality educator, and he said it's just been so empowering to him to be able to reach out to our own community and inform. And he is a member of the Central team located in the Lansing area of our state. All right. Andre, anything you want to add? And we'll take questions right now if anybody has questions regarding the Michigan initiative.
Yes, I will fill any questions that you have right now.
Hi, Mary, can you hear me?
I can. Go ahead,
Hey.
Leah.
Hi, my name is Leanne. I'm with Missouri
Leanne, okay.
Oh, yeah.
Missouri DDC, and I candidly got pulled into a phone call right at the beginning of this presentation, so was able to actively start listening about 10 minutes in. And what I want to make sure I understand correctly is the Elevatus training is a model that that can be replicated in other states. Am I hearing that correctly?
Absolutely. So
Okay.
we worked with Katherine to bring it to Michigan. You'll hear in a short period of time from Kimberly Berg from New York, and they're working with Elevatus training. And there are other states that have either contacted me or contacted Katherine about how can we replicate what you're doing in Michigan and in our state. So yes, it can be replicated in other states.
Well, this was super helpful and informational. And I know that here in Missouri, we have identified, kind of like you were talking about, like kind of did a self-reflect. Okay, are we addressing this? How are we addressing it? And big fan of not recreating the wheel, especially when something so effective exists. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah, I'm always for not reinventing the wheel. And when, I've been teaching sexuality education, but I'd never, put all my stuff together in a package and into a curriculum. And when I was asked to figure out what we would want to offer, I looked at Katherine's curriculum, and my thought was, if I were going to design something, it would be just like this. So why would I design something when it already exists? So yeah. And our contact information will be available on the last slide. So feel free to contact us if you want to hear more from either Kimberly or I of how we've taken this curriculum and implemented it within our state. Were there any other questions before we go on to hear more about New York? Regina writes in the chat, I've taken Katherine's class, but struggle to get parents and guardians to let their individuals attend. Mm-hmm. Regina, call me. or call Katherine. Contact us, because I'd love to talk with you more about that. I have done a lot of those presentations. And so when a team in Michigan is struggling with that, I will go out and come alongside them and work with them to have some parent meetings ahead of time to describe the curriculum and to share statistics and information. And I always present with one of the self-advocates or several self-advocates from teams. Andre, did you have something you wanted to say about that? Okay. Andre, there's a real delay, so I'm not sure. Okay, we'll go on to the next question. Andre will come in when he can on any of these answers. Any other questions for us?
I was going
I'm
to say,
excited. Go ahead.
Yes.
You're up, Andre.
Okay. Are there any more questions?
Okay. Andre, do you have anything to say about parents and guardians who, if somebody's struggling to get parents or guardians let them to be in a class?
It's really important that we get the parents. Because that's where it starts at. And so they won't be so afraid about what's going on. Like my situation was, because my parents was real open.
Okay. And so one of the things about the curriculum is in the beginning, it helps you to set that up, and it helps you with ideas on how to talk to parents and guardians and things like that. So yeah, we can certainly share more information about that with you, Regina. And then Katherine, I know you were going to say something. Why don't you go next? And then I'm excited to hear about New York and what they're doing there.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, Regina, that we've been doing, Elevatus training is doing some monthly drop-in sessions with people who have attended the 3-day training so they can problem solve and say, all right, I'm struggling with this. And then people give them ideas. And so that might be really helpful to you, or reaching out to Mary for her ideas, or myself, and, help you problem solve and maybe come up with some solutions, because it is hard. And I'm not sure what state you're in, because it really does depend on the states as well. All
and then
right.
we have one hand up. Deb?
Oh, great.
Is it me, D?
Oh, I'm sorry, D.
Oh, okay.
My
So,
vision's not the best.
No, it's okay. Just a quick question for you. So what is your understanding, just looking in the chat, what is the hesitancy that parents have or guardians have with allowing their loved one to attend the training?
I can start out that conversation. Oftentimes that once we start a presentation for parent groups with the concept that we're sexuality educators and not sex educators, yes, we do teach about sex and intercourse, but we're teaching about a much bigger topic. And then we talk about what happens, and we share research about how people that have not received education are more likely to have an earlier onset first sexual experience. They're more likely to experience STIs and STDs because of lack of information on how to avoid that. They have a higher, people without education, sexuality education, have a higher number of unplanned pregnancies. And so when we start to talk about all of that, then we hear parents kind of changing, like, how soon can we get started? When they hear the facts about, various studies that have been done. But that seems to be the biggest barrier, is you're going to teach them about sex and they're going to go have sex. And there's much more involved in sexuality than just intercourse.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, there's a lot of anxiety about it from parents that, if they're in a relationship, my son or daughter's in a relationship, they're going to get taken advantage of, or something bad's going to happen. And so there's just this hesitancy to, letting that happen, that knowledge. So a lot of fear, I think. So when we can, like Mary said, reassure parents around what it does, the positive impact the sexuality education has, and that sexuality education is sexual abuse prevention, then they start like, oh, okay. And start to realize that lack of information is making somebody more vulnerable.
Yeah, and I'm just going to jump in for some of the things that we've seen in New York too. And I think, Mary, you brought up a really important point about, people think, well, if we don't talk about it, then people they're not going to talk about it or think about it. But that's actually a huge problem that we see is if we don't talk about it and provide people factual, reliable information, then they'll go to the internet or they'll go to their friends. And so then they're getting information that is not necessarily accurate and that is not keeping people safe. So avoidance is not the alternative. It's providing people factual, useful, accessible information.
Right.
One more thing is parents worry that you're going to share a certain kind of value in the class, and sexuality education is fact-based, and if we don't share our own values, that's really the parents' role. But sometimes they feel like it, we're going to share values that may not be the same as the parents. So there's a couple fears there. And then in the chat, elevator speech, Lee, if you want to reach out to me, I have a bunch of elevator speeches that we create during the training. So if you're talking to a parent, this is some things you can say, points you want to make, and that kind of thing. But yeah, you have to get buy-in. And so it's good to have, the 5 main points you want to make.
Well, even from our council, we need to try to get buy-in, because there's the thought is, well, parents really aren't asking for this. And we as the council have a responsibility to listen to what the parents are really wanting, with their kids and for their kids. And people with disabilities, they're not asking for it either. And I'm thinking, well, it's such a taboo subject. I know that I think a lot of people are very uncomfortable putting it out there.
Yeah.
And those that are comfortable are either seeking those avenues. But yet exactly what you said, it's not about teaching sex. It's not about teaching values or your own values. It's about really giving a broad understanding so that people can be protected and can understand what their rights are. I mean, everything else that's around that, not just one particular act or whatever. I had a cousin who has a daughter who's 17, and she's verbal to a degree, but she really needed a lot of education, and her parents thought that that's what it was, that the education was to get her sexually involved. And I said, no. I said, is she acting like a typical 15 or 16-year-old with her body? And if she is, then you need to talk to her about safe ways to deal with her urges, her emotions, her feelings.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And then we had a question in the chat about school-based curriculum for students who have disabilities. So I can only speak to the Michigan school-based laws. So it's up in Michigan, it's up to each individual school district. And there's a whole set of rules and values. Any curriculum has to go through their Sexuality Education Advisory Board, and there's timeframes by which those meetings need to be posted. They're open meetings for parents to attend. So it's a lengthy process. We do have some schools in Michigan and some teams that are located at ISDs who are teaching either all or part of the curriculum. We have other school districts who, if you offer it outside of the school setting, outside of a school building and outside of school hours. So for example, if a local ARC offers this course, then the school and the teachers and the administration can advertise that, hey, we're not offering it here, but you can sign up your son or daughter for a class at the local ARC. And what I'm seeing more and more in Michigan is it's the parents who are calling and requesting it. How do we get our kids involved? How can my son or daughter get education? Why isn't it in our local area? And those are the catalysts of putting new teams together, because it's the parents and the individuals with disabilities saying, no, I need this information. So I'm excited to hear from Kimberly now about New York.
Yes.
I was going to say, Katherine, you didn't even need to pass the mic, Mary. You did it.
You did it.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about how we structured our project, and we're still very much in process. So we're actually still in year 1 of that project. It's a 2-year project, but it's interesting to hear, what's going on in different states, because we here in New York, at least with our council, so this has been a topic of conversation and of interest for a while, and so our individual members and then our family members have been very interested in doing a project on sexuality. And actually, she was a family member, but also ran a provider agency. So she had some personal and professional experience dealing with this topic from a few different perspectives. So this has been something that the council has looked into doing and has been kind of on our radar for several years now. So actually, the start of that was bringing Katherine into one of our council meetings to be a part of a panel to talk about sexuality and what issues we're seeing and what people can do about it, how we can start to actually do some work in this area. So we brought Katherine then in for that project, the 2-year project that I said. We're still in year 1, but we really wanted to, and I think this is the neat thing that everyone can take away too, is that Katherine, not only the curriculum that she's developed, but also kind of the structure is very adaptable to your state, right? So that's, I think, the beauty of this is that you can really kind of structure a project that's going to work for you and your state and kind of the targets that you want to hit. So we wanted to make sure that we were touching the 3 kind of main cohorts, right? So people, staff who work in agencies, people with disabilities themselves, and then families, right? So we wanted to work in all of those areas, make sure that we were able to provide training, skills-based training, and again, that factual information so that these groups that we were training would go out and expand the training in their local areas. So we really set up a train-the-trainer model. And New York, I mean, many of the states, you know, on today's presentation, attendees have a similar issue where it's hard to cover all of that territory, right? So we wanted to make sure that we were reaching, especially some of those rural areas of the state where we see more of this lack of information being provided to people happening. So we wanted to make sure that we were reaching everybody in these areas, but we weren't able to kind of do that training ourselves. So the train-the-trainer model was the best approach, where we would establish these cohorts of trainers. They would go out to their local areas and then provide the training or provide workshops, whatever that area kind of needed and whatever that area, kind of the culture of that area called for. So some, you know, attending a full day training or a 2-day training is maybe not going to be feasible for some people, but if there are ways to get the conversation started and to begin to make those shifts. So that's really our goal. This project also started during COVID, right? So everybody can, you know, relate to what that has meant for trying to pivot the work. We had it initially planned for all of these trainings. So the staff trainings, the parent trainings, and then the staff, people with IDD, team trainings to be in person. We switched the timeline a little bit. So those 2 years, it was just going to be a mix of all of those types of trainings in the different regions of New York State. We had to adapt that timeline a little bit because we really wanted to make sure that the training was going to be valuable for the attendees and whatever their circumstances were going to be. So this past spring is when we started the staff trainings. And we were able to do those remotely. You know, by this point in time, people were familiar with attending trainings online and doing most things online. So, so we did those on the front end. And then we are doing the parent trainings this fall. They're also going to be remote because, you know, obviously the COVID situation is one that changes by the day, it feels like sometimes. So we wanted to make sure that we were still able to reach people, still able to continue the work, but keeping people safe. And then when we do the trainings for the staff, people with IDD teams, we really want those to be in person. So we have kind of pushed those off toward the end of the 2-year period in hopes that we'll be able and people will feel comfortable meeting in person, taking a training in person. But really that's where the value for people with IDD is going to be, is the in-person trainings. So we're hopeful that we'll be able to do that. And then I just wanted to add, you know, something that even once we started the project, one of the ways that we kind of adapted the work is establishing some parent workshops. So through some different partners that the DDPC had, we kind of had some conversations that with some different communities. So obviously New York is a very diverse state, and so we have different communities within the state that we also like to target. So through some of our partners, they had mentioned, you know, we have parents that are interested in this topic, but they're not ready for a full 2-day training. so how can we start the conversation? So that's where the parent workshops came in. That wasn't an original part of our plan, but it became a really valuable way to engage other parents who are curious, who don't necessarily feel like they have the skills, but want to start learning. And so, you know, that was helpful to not only kind of expand some of the grant work, but also hopefully to create a feeder or like you know, some recruitment for the parent trainings in the fall. So if people get a little taste of, okay, here's what this looks like, here's kind of how we start to talk about these things, and hopefully some of those folks will feel comfortable to continue the conversation in the fall. So we really have adapted in real time, which has been, I think, really helpful. And Katherine has been great to work with, you know, throughout all of this. So thank you so much to you for working with us and for being responsive to the different needs that we have in New York. That's been very helpful. So at this point, I think I'll pass it back to you, Katherine, right?
Okay, yeah, great. And just to show you this a little bit more, I mean, Kimberly talked about the purple parts, the trainings. And so the idea is that these trainers will go back and lead Sexuality 101 training for other staff. So it's also a peer education model where a staff person becomes the trainer and then teaches the other staff. Parents, they're parents of young and grown children with developmental disabilities, and they'll go back to their communities and train other parents around how to talk to your kids. So it's a, you know, not only with self-advocates as a peer education model, but also parents and staff, like, you know, just understanding each other's lived experiences can give more to a training, give that rich experience as well. And then our hope is that people will be, you know, gain knowledge and skills, and there's lots of ways to reach people. But I'll tell you about the data, and then I think then we'll open it up for questions. But so we did the 4 staff trainings this spring online, like Kimberly said. They were 2 days, and we reached 89 staff. So they were trained in how to lead workshops in their community for other staff. And the overall rating was a 4.6 out of 5. And we also had participants think back to when they first came to the training that morning till the end and rate themselves on these questions of, you know, do you have the necessary knowledge and skills to lead staff training? Do you feel confident to get buy-in from staff to talk one-on-one with people? And are you confident that you can advocate for the sexual and relationship health needs of people with IDD? And you can see before the training, the average was 2.2. At the end of the training, it was 4.2. And the next one, 2.2, and the average was 4, and then 3.1 and 4.6. So you can see the change in 2 days of training. Now, you know, there's lots more work to do. You learn that, you go back, you try it, you implement, you learn, you know, there's a lot still to learn, but people really, you can see the increase from before and after. And then the last thing, which was similar to the Michigan project, but we did do a pre-assessment first. So all the staff took a test, so to speak, and the average score was a 59.8. And then at the end of the training, the average score was a 94.7. So again, you can see an increase in knowledge, skills, you know, competence. And then we also, like Kimberly said, we did 8 workshops. We, as she said, pivoted because, as you know, the pandemic, and parents were more overwhelmed than they were before, right? Because they're home, they're working from home, their kids are home. And so, you know, it just felt like not the right time. So here's a way to, you know, reach parents that is easier for the parents. We did one of the workshops in Spanish. One of our parent trainers is bilingual, and we reached 440 parents of young and grown children just through those workshops. So we had 2 parent trainers that have children with developmental disabilities, and they were the trainers. And as far as, you know, that pre-post, we asked, do you have the necessary knowledge and skills to talk to your child about sexuality? And before they said the average was 3.3 and at the end 4.4. So an increase in confidence. And actually, I think I had you down for this part, Kimberly.
Yeah, and I think it went over most of it, so I won't take too long on this slide. But as I mentioned, we kind of did the staff trainings on the front end, right? That was the easiest thing to kind of get off the ground. People were comfortable and familiar with using online platforms. So this fall, we'll focus on the parents, and then in the spring, like I said, fingers crossed, we'll be able to do in-person trainings. Folks will be comfortable with that, but that's where we'll get to people with disabilities themselves and building skills amongst people with IDD. So we're excited about that. And then we've also been able to add another parent training and then staff training. So we'll work those into the schedule as well. We've seen a lot of demand, which is really helpful. So, you know, I think for New York, that's one thing where there has been a lot of interest. So we haven't had to do a lot of kind of recruiting or convincing people. It's been fairly easy to get people on board. People want this information from what we've seen by and large. With that said, you know, we know that we're not reaching everybody, and that's kind of, you know, our work more generally. We always try to reach out to different communities, and there's definitely different areas of the state where we have stronger connections than others. So that's a continual effort on the council's part to make that presence a little bit stronger in all areas of the state. But generally speaking, we've had really good interest and feedback.
Yeah, and both Michigan Project and New York, we did follow-up webinars afterwards as well to learn more and also do that problem solving around, oh, I'm having, I'm facing some barriers in my community. What can I do? And so we're doing those webinars in year 2 for New York, but we did them in Michigan as well, because people, it is, you know, you can go to a training and feel all jazzed up and ready to go, and then you go back and it can be really hard to get buy-in and convince others that this is a good thing. And so how just providing that ongoing support to people, even if they can't get something done, you can get ideas and just start working on building your relationships in the community.
The teams in Michigan all really support each other. And, we've had some teams where people came, they knew they wanted to develop a team in their area, but they hadn't at that time identified self-advocates. So, we will come alongside them and help bring self-advocates from other teams to help get them started. And then during those first classes, as they're teaching to adults with developmental disabilities, they can identify potential trainers that they want to then go through the TOT training and become trainers in their local area. So our focus is really that every team would have people with IDD as part of the team as well.
Great. So that is the New York project. And does anyone have any questions for Kimberly or myself around the New York one? You can see the similarities to Michigan, but also moving more into staff and parent training as well. Any questions?
Yes, that's true.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, we wanted to spend the last few minutes just talking to Mary and Kim about the sort of the DD council perspective. Because I'm not part of a DD council, but I'm working with lots of DD councils, but sort of thinking about what's worked well and any barriers that the council has had, and then advice you would have for other states if they're thinking about a project like this, and how can other states get these sort of positive results? Like, what do you find, what would you say are best practices for doing a statewide training, TOT training? So either one of you want to start with worked well, or?
Kimberly, if you want to start. And
yeah, so as I mentioned, I think the thing for us that's worked really well And actually, I'm gonna answer what worked well and struggles because they're related. So what worked well for us, like I said, is that our council, this was a priority. So we didn't have to do any kind of convincing or get people on board in that sense, which was really good. And actually, the more that I kind of traveled around and got feedback when we could travel and got feedback from folks throughout the state at different events, people were like, yes, we want this information. We want this. So that was very exciting in that we didn't feel like we had to do a ton of work to get people on board. We kind of had that built in, so it was pretty easy to move ahead. With that said, though, and kind of the other side of the same coin is that what we found and what we continue to see is that there's oftentimes a champion or somebody who's like, yes, this is great, this is awesome, we've been looking for this information, but they might be like a team of one, right, amongst their agency. So, I'm thinking especially in regards to staff at an agency. So maybe one person or a handful of people are really excited about it, but the agency culture doesn't necessarily lend itself to infusing this throughout. So sometimes you'll get some people on board, but their ability to kind of change the agency culture or the provider, getting the provider on the whole on board, that's where the gap is. So there is still, I think, a lot of that kind of shifting mindset to be done. And from the provider perspective, I mean, oftentimes it's like a liability thing, right? Their kind of perspective is to protect the people they're serving and providing services to. And so that's where we get into that kind of sticky area. And I think similar to maybe some of the parent concerns, like, well, if we give people this information, then is that going to open a can of worms for us? So that is some of the larger kind of systems change work that we still need to do as far as helping to progress the culture a little bit and change the mindset around what sexuality means and who, at least historically has been allowed access to that. And obviously our perspective is everybody has sexuality, right? Everybody experiences that in different ways. So how do we foster that and make sure that we're keeping people safe? So it's kind of that two sides of the same coin. We have champions, but we also have some barriers to larger scale culture change.
And I would just add to that information, what I think's worked well in Michigan is our commitment to having people with IDD at the table from beginning to end of this. That's just critical. And when you go to, meetings with parents and other individuals, and you have a person with a disability saying, I'm a sexual human being and I need this information, and here's why I need that information. Or you have people that have shared their story of dealing with sexual abuse. It just really gets people on board. And another approach that we take when we come up against that barrier is, was mentioned earlier, we get parents to talk to parents. So we have parents on teams, and parents will, don't, this isn't DD Council saying this is another parent of a young adult, and you're hearing this from them. We get teachers to talk to teachers. We get judges to talk to judges and lawyers to talk to lawyers. So that's an approach that can really help kind of get you past those barriers, as well as sharing the facts, the statistics, the number of people with disabilities that are incarcerated for a sex crime and really have no idea what they did that was a crime, and don't understand things like public or private or adult versus minor and some key concepts. So, when we talk about where we have a curriculum that covers all of those kind of things, it really does help break down those barriers. We offered this summer, and we've got one class left of a 6-week course doing the 22 lesson, creating healthy relationships at work. So we, met with vocational counselors from all over the state and said, what are the issues that you're seeing? And then when they hear, wow, there's a curriculum that can help, they were really open about helping to advertise for that class and discussing further collaborations after we're done with this first class. So just things to think about. And the last question here was, what advice do you have for other states thinking about a project like this? I would say the Nike theory, just do it. Just get started. I mean, it's so critically important. I can't begin to tell you in the almost 40 years I've been teaching sexuality education, the number of people who have just benefited from that autonomy to make decisions about their sexual health, and that power that comes with the education is just so critical. So just do it. Just get started. Andre, do you have anything to say about that?
Say that again.
What advice do you have for other states that are thinking about doing a sexuality education project?
Don't be afraid. We need to give people the tools to be an all-around person, and not be afraid to talk about what's real about life.
Yeah,
Couldn't have said it better myself.
exactly. Well, I like just do it and don't be afraid, right? Those are good messages. Kim, I don't know if you have any advice for states around this.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, like, for us, we're starting small, right? So if we think about the number of people we're training relative to, you know, everyone in the state, it's small, but we're hoping that that's, you know, the little push that we need to really get things rolling. And so we're starting how we can, and then it will branch out from there. And, you know, we're excited to see how it progresses over the coming years.
And I often think about, you know, yeah, sometimes you can have some pushback and people are worried or anxious. And, but I think, okay, so I might feel a little uncomfortable when people are saying, oh, you know, this isn't a good idea and all that. But what happens because of lack of education is really traumatic and devastating. That for me to be a little bit uncomfortable and a little scared, I would take that over some of the negative consequences of lack of education. So, you know, it sort of seems like a no-brainer in a lot of ways. Like there's just a lot of really negative things happening for people, and sexuality education can help with that, even if people are a little uncomfortable. And it looks like the Nebraska and DC DD Council have a couple different people applying for grants to use the Elevatus training and teach in the community, and that's great. And I'm guessing I know Allison, the two people that are doing the one in the DC area. But yeah, so that's great. So lots of ideas and opportunities. Any last thoughts or questions from any of you? We have one last wrap-up question for all of you. Oh, this is all of our contact information too, so that's on the slide. But we have emails and websites and all those things for the four of us. And then the last question is, what's one thing that you plan to do to promote sexual self-advocacy and leadership opportunities for self-advocates, since you've been listening and some of you are already involved in projects? You could put those in the chat, or you can unmute and just say something you're thinking about, you know, sort of what you might do, even just to start small. Call Mary and Katherine to get, yes, all right. Keep talking about it, great, yeah.
Hi, this is Zos from Hawaii.
Hi, Zos.
Hi, I'm with the Hawaii State Council on Developmental Disabilities. And in our new 5-year state plan, we are taking on the challenge of promoting self-advocacy with sexuality training. So two of us on staff have enrolled in your class, Katherine, on how to become trainers, and listening to the advice and the things that New York and have gone through, and all the different things that we're trying to promote here in Hawaii. We're gonna hopefully do mimic and imitate the groundwork that's been laid before us, so that we can provide training here in Hawaii for our self-advocates and staff and family members. So thank you so much for today's presentation.
Great. I look forward to spending time with you at the training.
Yeah, thank you.
So Liz is saying we have self-advocates doing a training with a domestic violence training for direct support providers. Excellent. So yeah, lots of different work going on, and every little bit helps. So that's wonderful. And then I know Oklahoma's got some self-advocates doing some work. I said it, Lee, I have some elevator speeches I can share with you. It's actually part of the 3-day training, and we keep all of them from different participants. But that's my email. If you want to reach out, I can send you some of those just to give you some ideas. But yeah, I would also just suggest thinking about why do I want this to happen? Why would we want to teach this? And kind of come up with your key ideas and deliver that as well. Yeah, great. So
I also have some slides with sort of those key points when we're presenting to family groups or guardianship groups. And so, yeah, our contact information is on the previous slide.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so just reach out to any of us if you're facing barriers or you want more information or anything. We're hoping to help other states do this work as well, and learn from other states too about what works and what doesn't. So thank you all. And Mary, Andre, Kimberly, thank you 3. Do you have any parting words? We have 1 more minute.
I just threw my contact in the chat as well.
Good. Yeah, someone just asked to bring it back. So yes, I can put them all in there. Although I think, Andre, that's an old email. And Kimberly, maybe you could put yours in there. Oh, you did. You're way ahead of me. You're welcome. And it's 3:30. So thank you all for being here. And you take care and have a good rest of your night.
I also just wanted to remind people, if you're interested, there will be a closing presentation at 4 if you log back onto the NACDD Brand Live page, and that will be on disability representation in Hollywood.
Oh, nice. Great. All right. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Bye, everybody.